leadership of the great physician welcomes you to House Call. Our hosts today are doctors of chiropractic, Dr. Gerald Lala and Dr. Richard Jensen, who is also a board-certified acupuncturist and practice independently in Shoreland, Minnesota. Let's join our hosts for today's program that will assist you in your quest for optimal health and well-being.
Welcome to House Call. I'm Dr. Gerald Lala.
And I'm Dr. Richard Jensen.
It's wonderful to have you with us. It's great to have a good program for you today. We're going to do a couple-part series here on blood analysis, and you might say, what in God's grace are two chiropractors doing about blood analysis? Don't chiropractors work on spines and whiplashes and workers' comp injuries and muscles and ligament problems? Yes, they do, but Dr. Jensen and I, many years ago, realized that spinal manipulation wasn't an end in itself, but that many of the health problems that people were having were related to biochemical problems within the person's body, and certainly some chiropractors believe that. There's nothing wrong with that, it's true, but that there are all kinds of methods out there that are non-scientific based. They're not scientifically based on the nutrition that they use, even though they'll say it is, and they go to seminars that tell them it is, but when you really go out there and look to see if it is credible information, you find that it's not. So we are then a minority of chiropractors in this area of the country, a very small minority who would order blood tests, urine tests, hormone tests, all kinds of different tests that would be appropriate to people's health. And today we're going to talk about blood analysis. In the state of Minnesota, chiropractors can draw blood, not that many do. We can order blood, the same blood tests or different laboratory tests that medical doctors can, so it's not an issue to do that. So what does a blood test tell us? Well, blood tests give markers. So when we order blood tests and the patient goes to a lab near their home, and then those blood tests come back, their list of markers, and Dr. Jensen is going to discuss what markers are now.
Thank you, Dr. Lala. Well, there is certain markers that we can have. We look at life is in the blood, but let's put it this way. If you look at blood flow, in 40 minutes, your entire blood volume passes through your eyes. And so if something's wrong, a lot of times you can see it in the eyes. Or let's say you have anemia, and anemia, you look at the bottom of their eyelids and see if they're a nice pink, or if they're a little too bright, that could be anemia that's taking place in there. But what that does is it's kind of a little bit of a marker, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so what we like to do is take a look at these markers, and the blood gives us a great deal of markers that we can look at things from that. Not only do we have a blood count that tells us about anemia, we can see the hemoglobin, how that is, and that tells us some of the nutrients, such as if we're up in B12 or in folic acid. Well, if it's not just looking at that to see if it's the B12, you look at the homocysteine, and that's a marker of how B12 levels are also. So we're doing lots of checks and balances within that.
And we've learned that to prescribe diets, vitamins, minerals, homeopathic remedies, essential oils, without knowing what the person's individual markers are. In other words, we can look at the outside of somebody and say, gee, that's what they look like. They've got brown hair, they've got blue eyes, or whatever it might be. They're 6'2", or whatever their weight or height might be. Those certainly are indications.
Right.
But we don't know the individual biochemical nature of that person until we order these tests to find out what the markers are.
Exactly.
And once we know the markers are, then we know what that body needs, because it tells us.
Because it tells us what they need.
That's right.
And
or what they don't need.
Or what they don't need. And sometimes what happens is if you say, oh, they're low in B12, and you just take a lot of B12. Well, B12 will actually mask symptoms of being low in folic acid. So you need to look at the markers to see what's going on as to what the balance there is.
That's right.
So it's a very hazardous walk.
That's right.
to do this without taking the test.
That's right.
So the first signs of biochemical disease are in the blood. We can sense these things from looking at the blood in its ranges, whether we're tending towards disease or tending more towards health.
Because the absence of symptoms doesn't necessarily indicate the internal presence of wellness. So people who think that they must be healthy because they feel good doesn't necessarily mean that internally they're healthy.
No.
Like that heart attack that occurs, it just didn't occur overnight. It may have come at that millisecond, but there's been something going on in that body for a long time. Same thing with osteoporosis, osteopenia, arthritis, or fibromyalgia, any Alzheimer's.
Right,
You know?
right. It's been a process. It
That's
wasn't just yesterday you were fine and today all of a sudden gone.
But for years, they think they felt well, but if somebody had looked at their blood years ago, you could have seen markers that were indicating that osteoporosis was on the possibility, or Alzheimer's, or dementia, or Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis.
It's a lot easier to make a course correction in an ocean liner at the beginning of the trip than it is to bring it all the way down from one of the polar caps all the way down to the mid, like equatorial area.
Yeah.
It's much easier to make that little turn at that point.
That's right. And a lot of people are then, when they do get in the port, instead of getting into the port of health, they get into the port of sickness and disease and death.
Right, right. Many times we climb ladders and find out we're on the wrong wall.
Yeah,
and testing allows us to get you on the right ladder.
We may die in a microsecond, but very often that death process leading up to that microsecond of the last heartbeat has been going on for years.
Right. So when we look at that, we're saying that we can look at things before they get to a clinical stage, and the clinical stage is where the symptoms come on. And so symptoms, if we look at the absence of symptoms, as Dr. Lala was just saying, does not necessarily mean an internal state of wellness. So what we do is if we're taking vitamins, or somebody is suggesting vitamins or supplements or drugs or what have you without testing, they're actually shotgunning those things at you. Well, we'll see. We'll throw this at it, see if it works. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily the right way to go. And you could look at broad spectrum drugs or broad spectrum food exploitation. Or you could make broad spectrum diet changes that are not necessarily the right thing for them. Or do exercise programs that will not address the areas of particular people and their body types, such as some body types need to have that more long-term type of endurance type exercises, where other body types need to have a particular exercise that's more of the short-term muscle building kind of anaerobic exercise in order to have them work the best. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have cookbook recipes and cookbook chiropractic and
cookbook acupuncture
and cookbook vitamins and minerals, supplementation that way, as well as cookbook drugs that people do without even checking. So how do we in our way take that from a cookbook perspective and bring it down to the individual?
Well, we do that, and it's really quite inexpensive in that when Dr. Jensen and I order blood tests, for example, when they come back from the laboratory, the computer printout has them in a clinical range. So all across America, all of the different companies that do laboratory testing, they have parameters. So they have a low parameter and a high parameter. As long as that marker falls somewhere between the low and the high, it will be considered normal. If it falls below the low, then an L is printed on the computer printout. If it is above the high mark, then an H is printed there. So when we have a clinical parameter that is too low or too high, that are out of those parameters, that is considered a clinical issue. It is considered that there is pathology going on inside of that body. Now, unless somebody is gravely ill, there aren't going to be really a lot of clinical highs or lows on those blood reports. So the doctor says, hey, why even do it? You feel good. Why do it? Saves money. Well, it doesn't really save money. What it does in the long run, it costs money because the traditional clinical is an orthodox standard ranges, but there's another range called a homeostatic range, which is an optimal or ideal range. So it's a range that sets the low a little bit lower and the high a little bit high, and that gives us an idea like you're coming up to an intersection. There's no red light there, but some markers are showing, look, a yellow light. Watch out, be very cautious here. This calcium is starting to get a little bit low. This cholesterol is starting to get a little high, but it's homeostatically high or low. It's not up in the red zone yet, in the red zone. So, again, the absence of symptoms, the absence of clinical highs or lows does not necessarily indicate the presence of wellness. This then means that there are early warning signs. If you were at work with somebody or out on a social thing and this guy is saying, things aren't going too good, at home, and there's a gal at work, she's a pretty nice gal, and a little younger than my wife, and she looks pretty good to me. She's a really good-looking woman. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that this guy is going to go out and have an extramarital affair, but it says that there's a warning sign there that this guy, if he truly is in love with his wife, he's not going to be thinking about other women. He's actually taking that from a temptation down into his heart. So in the case of homeostatic early warning signs, they're like a yellow warning light, as I said a few moments ago, at intersections of health. They are not being checked in the lab. The labs are not geared for them. I don't know why they don't do it, but they just don't. I guess there's not enough money in it for them because there's not much money in doing that. Clinical signs are red lights at the intersection of health. All is good when there's green lights. In other words, when there is no highs or lows in the clinicals and there's no highs or lows in the homeostatic, you got a green light there and you say, hey, this body is heading for good health. It is in good health. So who are we then looking at? We then are, at least in our concept of health, we're looking at the whole person. This is not just some term like wellness center or we practice alternative health care. That most of those terms are shams because when you really go in and look inside those programs, they're not really doing that much in the whole person. They're really not. So we're looking at the whole person, or what they're really doing is looking at maybe one or two or three aspects of the whole person. Certainly it's good not to be involved with tobacco products. Certainly it's not good to be overweight. Certainly it's not good to abuse alcohol. Certainly it is good to do some exercise. But that's not really the whole person. Certainly it's good to minimize stress. Certainly it's good to minimize the ingestion of saturated fatty acids and refined carbohydrates. But that's not really wellness. That's not really wellness. So what then saves money? Let's talk about the basic part of here. What saves money? What really saves money saves health. So looking at the whole person, that's what saves money, and it saves health. So are you going to wait then for red lights to go on? That's what's happening in managed healthcare. We're waiting for the red lights to go on, but we're saying, oh no, we're not. We're just don't smoke, just don't drink, don't be overweight, don't eat fats or sugars. All right, that's not really wellness care. They're still waiting for a red light to go on, which indicates that there is some problem within the internal biochemical systems of that body. So when a person has a whole person blood analysis, it consists of two panels. And Dr. Jensen, I think, is prepared to discuss those with you.
Thank you, Dr. Lala. Well, we're looking at more panels. There's two parts. One part would be the blood profile, which may consist of a multitude of different panels. And then there's another part called the CBC, and the CBC is called complete blood count. And so first we're going to pay attention to that. In the complete blood count, you're looking at the constituents of the blood, meaning as it presents as a whole, such as the red blood cells, which are the cells that we use to transport oxygen through our system. Then you have white blood cells. White blood cells are basically your immune system in action. Okay, there's the hematocrit, which is the part of the red blood cell that's metabolically active. Then we have the platelets. The platelets are the part of the blood that help us to stop bleeding. They're actually part of the scab that's formed. Hemoglobin is part of the hematocrit, and the hemoglobin is the part of the blood that actually grabs onto the oxygen in the lungs and delivers it to the tissues, and then as it releases that, it grabs onto the carbon dioxide and brings it back to the lungs for that to be excreted. And then we're looking at MCV and MCH are two other markers. One is talking about the volume of the blood cell, and the other one's talking about the color of the blood cell. That says, well, if the blood cell is a little pale, it doesn't contain as much of the hemoglobin and hematocrit that hang on to the oxygen, so it's a little bit low in that. So you might have enough blood, but it doesn't have that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchanging capacity to it. If it's too large in volume, then it's not getting into the very small capillaries down to the very cells as easily. And so we might have a large problem which can lead to things such as anemia. Now, MCHC is another marker that's much like the volume and the color put together. And then we look at in the white blood cells. There are many different types of these white blood cells, such as monocytes and neutrophils, and eosinophils are actually the red blood cell, but then you have lymphocytes and monocytes, which are the white blood cells. And we can see from the difference in counts of those what may be going on in the immune system. If you have a increase in the neutrophils, we can see that you're fighting off bacterial infection or a cold or something that's going on also. Then we go on to the blood profile. And now the blood profile panels include things such as albumin, which is the protein within the blood, the main protein in the blood, but we also know that is manufactured primarily within the liver, so we can see how the liver function is doing. Alkaline phosphatase, which is talking about bone remodeling. And so if we have healthy bones, or if we have too much bone being made, such as in a blastic cancer, that just lays down bone every which way, and it's a terrible disease to have. We can look at too much alkaline phosphatase is a bad thing. Globulin is another blood protein, and so we're looking at albumin and globulin ratios to see what's going on. We don't want to see those flip. We want to see more albumin than globulin. Albumin also carries around different things to different parts of the body also, such as your calcium and other electrolytes to the other areas of the body. Hormones are part of
Antibodies.
that. Antibodies. Globulins are the immune functions, such as your antibodies.
And so the albumin is really is protein, and it's the transporter of the hormones and of the vitamins and the minerals and antibodies. And if there's some issue within the digestive system that's preventing the proper digestion of proteins, then that albumin is not going to be there to be the transporter that's needed. And everything in the body is really put in ratios. Everything is ratio, and we're going to be talking about that in this and the other program too, so you can have a good understanding of that.
So really what we're looking at are things that talk about the actual internal workings of the body.
Such as bilirubin here in the liver, right?
As bilirubin also. Bilirubin has a great deal to do with what's going on with your blood, whether your blood is being exchanged constantly, where red blood cells are being broken down and taken care of in the liver and recycled back into making more blood. And if there's a breakdown in the processing of that, your bilirubin can go way up. Blood urea nitrogen, it's talking about the function of the kidneys. CO2 as a metabolic marker. Calcium as an electrolyte. And calcium is the most highly regulated electrolyte, and we've done numerous shows on calcium.
And the issue there is, they'll say, well, my bone density says I'm normal, or my bone density says I have osteopenia or osteoporosis, so therefore the doctor tells me I need calcium. True, But the fact is that if we evaluate that calcium periodically throughout their lifetime, it's going to tell us if that calcium is at a normal level homeostatically or if it's at a low level homeostatically. So if it's falling out of it may be normal clinically, but if it's not normal, if it's low homeostatically, it's telling us, look, this person is not either getting adequate amounts of calcium into their body, or they're getting adequate amounts of calcium in their body, but it's not a good form of calcium, therefore it is not readily digestible or readily absorbable, and or there could be some issue where it's not being carried by the amino acids up into the bones and the muscles and the ligaments. So again, waiting for a bone density study is foolish. It's really first you're looking at the blood because, as Dr. Jensen said a few moments ago, life is in the blood.
Right, and like what we're looking at with the calcium is actually transported by the albumin in the body, and so we're going to be looking at a calcium-albumin ratio to see if that's working. The other thing is if you're looking at calcium problems, you may be looking at thyroid or parathyroid problems. That's talking to so it's a good way of seeing what's going on early in a process too. And as Dr. Lalo was talking about, you really want to have a baseline of this for you as an individual so that we can look at it throughout different times of your life.
And that would bring up like chloride and cholesterol and HDL and LDLs, huh?
Absolutely, where we're used to seeing that within heart disease. Well, that does a lot of other things in our body also. Creatinine.
You know, sometimes the medical doctor, if you pressure him or her hard enough, they may order a lipid panel. You say, well, my cholesterol is high, or it's normal, my triglycerides are normal, my LDL, my HDL are normal. Well, yes, they're normal clinically, but they might be low or high homeostatically. And that's like waiting for disease to occur. And many times when they finally get symptoms, that car is like out of control going down a hill right into death, rather than catching it up here when it's starting to malfunction, even internally, but not noticeably externally. So by just doing a lipid panel is not the answer. Looking at a lipid panel, or just a lipid panel, might be looking at 4 fingers on this hand, but neglecting the 5th and the other 5 here. You're not getting a whole person evaluation.
Let's look at it this way. Also, if you're looking at the lipid panel and the lipid panel is out, what do you tend to do? Treat the lipid panel.
Right. And how do we treat the lipid panel in America? With drugs. We say, well, cut down on your fats. And then we pass laws saying you've got to not have saturated fats at the restaurants anymore. But still, it's telling us that there's some issue with the gallbladder and the liver that's causing an increase in those cholesterol or triglycerides.
Well, the other thing is that lipid panel is actually an early warning sign for metabolic problems with your sugars.
That's right.
That takes place 15 to 20 years before you go into diabetes.
Yep.
And so if you're not looking at the glucose panels also, you're not seeing the process that's going on in the body to stop it before it starts to occur.
Right.
Okay, so then we have creatinine and globulin. We talked about that some with the immune process. Looking at your glucose, as we just mentioned, phosphorus in the body, such as for bone health with phosphorus, potassium for high blood pressure. Many people are on high blood pressure pills that bottom out the potassium in their body, and that can put them into a disease process called hypokalemia, which is just due to too little potassium in the body. SGOT. Doctor, were you going to... okay, SGOT is actually an enzyme that has to do with the heart, to see how heart function is doing, and secondarily looking at the liver and liver function. As is SGPT. SGPT works with the liver also. It's more primarily about the liver, but can also talk about the heart. So you have to look at it in relationship to everything else that's going on in the body. Sodium, if you're sodium reactive, that could be talking about high blood pressure. It could also talk about your inability to hang on to fluids. It could talk about your inability to sweat. It can talk about your inability to do a number of things, because sodium is used to pull water around the body. Where you put sodium, water follows. That's why your sweat tastes so salty, is because first what happens is your body pumped the sodium to the outside and water followed. T4. T4, you're talking about thyroid function. As we talked about earlier, it's important to look at that with the calcium. Triglycerides, of course, it's part of looking at a lipid panel. Uric acid, which is looking at your kidneys again. Maybe you have the predisposition towards gout, which is excessive uric acid in the body. It would be nice to see if you're having that trend, and take care of it before you start to have gout, which forms crystals in the joints and then starts to form almost a grinding inside the joints, which leads to a type of arthritis. So Dr. Lala.
So there really is, like when Dr. Jensen was talking about glucose here, which would be blood sugar, which would be indicative of perhaps diabetes or other health problems. It may be normal clinically, but it may be starting to rise on the homeostatic aspect. It needs to be determined there. So there then is a great deal, and I'm not being negative now, but being truthful, because I want to be honest with you, because the truth is what sets people free. So many people think that just because their doctor does some blood test, that all of their biochemical status is evaluated, and that's not true, and we're saying that to you here. Why aren't they doing these tests on a routine basis? It's called money. The bottom line in the health industry and in every other aspect of society is money. They call it managed health care, wellness care, preventative care. It's a joke. Most of those words are nothing but empty words where little to nothing of comprehensive value is performed. Therefore, misrepresent or predispositions to future health problems. I'll give you an example of that. The soul of medicine and chiropractic is being cut out by managed health care because they're saying, look, you have to see so many patients a day, you have to give this adjustment, you can't do that, you can't do this physical therapy, you can't do this, you can't do that, and anywhere we're not going to pay for vitamins, we're not going to pay for blood studies, we're not going to do that. They're saying that same thing to medical doctors and chiropractors, especially the chiropractors who have joined these managed health care systems that think they're going to survive. Well, the fact is that, like, we had a couple in the clinic here recently, nice young couple, both of them had some back problems. Back problems are doing pretty good, but we saw some issues on their spinal x-rays that looked like there might be some metabolic problems. Said, you know, it'd probably be a good idea if you both had a blood test so we could see if there's some early warning signs here. Well, how much is it? It's a couple $100, so it was a very inexpensive test. Well, you know, we've got this boat down on the Stillwater River, and, you know, we got payments on that, and we're going to go up to the North Shore to do some skiing as it gets colder, and I've got a four-wheeler, and by the way, I work out at the health club 2 or 3 days a week, and you know, I buy my vitamins over at Target or Walmart or something like that. This guy's mother was a vitamin distributor too, and you're saying, where in God's nature are those people's priorities? Is that boat going to get them out of the hospital? Is that boat going to save her from osteoporosis? Is that boat going to save him from diabetes? And you just see these fools going right down into the hell of death. That's what's really happening. So again, if you want our business, you're going to have to say, we authorize it, and that's what you're going to have to say to these people. Now, why don't more chiropractors, for example, or nutritionists who are, if they are licensed to order blood tests, why aren't they doing it? Because it takes time. And time, everybody today is paid on volume. Plus, it's a lot easier to say, well, I'll do a muscle test, or I'll do this saliva test, and you buy the vitamins that I'm selling. See, you can make more money that way. But still, it's like playing Russian roulette. We're not knowing the individual biochemical nature of that person. So, if you want those tests done, you're going to have to, it's the squeaky wheel that gets oiled. And that's the one. You have to complain and say, look, I want this done. And if they don't want to do it, that's their problem. I think those doctors, I think those chiropractors, I think those nutritionists, and I think those massage therapists who are also selling vitamins, I think that they could be setting themselves up for some serious malpractice issues. I think that's an issue that's going to be occurring in our society, that I have not, in fact, been doing due diligence, just as much as we could not be doing due diligence on these programs, but here just to sell something. So, anyway, we're going to see on part 2, we're going to be more specific about these tests now and give you a good idea of it. Long life and good health to you.